Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Eric Targe. Eric Targe. We had a little mix-up on how to pronounce his name. So yes, it's Eric Targe. Eric joined the staff at Moody Church in 2013, where he now gives leadership and oversight to the college and disability ministry. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Moody Bible Institute, where he teaches a class on a theology of disability and ministry. And I explained how I got to know Eric over the last few months. He came out to the Exiles in Babylon conference, and that began what hopefully will be a long-term relationship. But this conversation is really relevant because it's been an interest of mine for at least a couple of years, and it's also going to be one of the 4 sessions at the Exiles in Babylon conference in 2023 here in Boise, Idaho, March 23rd to 25th. We're going to be talking about the future of the church. We're going to be talking about a theology of disability in the church. We're going to be talking about multi-ethnic perspectives on American Christianity. And then we are going to have a conversational debate on the problem of evil and suffering that Saturday morning, March 23rd to 25th. Get your tickets now. At the time of recording, at the time of this recording, we have about 150 early bird tickets available. 150 early bird tickets available. They're at a discounted rate. But by the time you are listening to this recording, the number might be a lot smaller than that. In fact, they might be all sold out. I'm not sure. But all the details are on the Theology in the Raw website, theologyintheraw.com, to sign up for Exiles in Babylon 2023. All right, let's get to know Eric Targe and his theology of disability and the church. Eric, thanks so much for coming on Theology in the Raw.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I mean, I've been listening to the podcast for about a year and a half, and it has been such a blessing. I was at the conference, and I'm so excited to be able to talk with you about
So that's how we connected. It was after you came out to the Exiles in Babylon conference. I don't think, did we connect? Yeah. Did we talk there or no? I don't remember.
No, I don't think so. I think I saw you and passed by you a couple times, especially at the after party. But you had swarms of people around you, and I mean, it was packed and it was happening. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was the after party. It's like about 500 people crammed in kind of a small space. And it was a blend of cloud nine exhilaration, people that I've seen from a distance, people telling me stories about the podcast, what it's done for their journey. And I was so emotionally overwhelmed I was just like, I just can't get my heart around these stories. And yet as an introvert who has been speaking for 2 days straight to go to, I was like, my body just almost started to shut down. A friend of mine saw me kind of starting to, just started to kind of like, he saw my face and I was just starting to kind of collapse mentally. And so he kind of pulled me under the room. Dang. I got a little away and I'm like, I think I need to go to bed. Like, this is just overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, when I saw you nearby, it looked like I was like, I'd love to introduce myself. But I saw the sharks going around, like everyone was waiting. They were circling and like, ooh, when this person leaves, I'm going to hop in. And I was like, oh, wow, everyone's waiting to talk to,
I didn't even
press.
That's so funny.
To lay a hand on his garment. And I was like, yeah, I'm just
Oh my gosh, stop. Yeah, that's so funny. So afterwards.
it was a phenomenal conference. Yeah.
So just to tell my audience, so you reached out afterwards and said, hey, would love to come back next year. Do you know if you're going to have a sign language interpreter at the next one? Instantly, I was like, I felt horrible because I'm like,
that was not my intention.
No, it's great. The answer is yes. And I instantly felt horrible that we didn't have one at the first one. And the reason why for sure we're having one, not only at the next one, but for everyone here on out, is because next year we are spending a whole session on a theology of disability in the church. And then you said that's kind of the area. Oh, because you were asking because you were going to bring out some, I think, leaders who are deaf, right? Or
so I wanted to really push to my leadership team. I wanted for our disability ministry here at my church. I serve at the Moody Church in Chicago, and I was like, hey, I'd love to advertise it to my leadership team and even see if I could give them a scholarship to come. But I didn't want to send it to everyone except for our deaf leaders. Right. I was like, no, I want to make sure that it's accessible to all before advertising it. And wanted to hear. And I was so glad that you guys are planning on doing that for the next conference.
Absolutely. And it's why I'm on a journey with this whole conversation, theology of disability, which is why I want to have you on. So tell us a little bit about what you do and how, and really in general, but also as it pertains to disability.
Yeah, so I'm a pastor here at the Moody Church. I've been on staff here for, 9 years now, 8 years of leading the disability ministry. We actually started the disability ministry here 8 years ago. And so I've led it to kind of have 5 different main areas. And we could talk about that in a little bit if you want, because I know one of our conversations that we had was just like, what actually is covered in disability? What parts is disability? What is other things? And in addition to that, right down the street is a college called Moody Bible Institute. And so I serve there as an adjunct professor. And so I teach a course called Disability Society in the Church. So my main roles are working with university students and disability. And down at the Institute, I do that. And up here, I do that, though, with students from a lot more different universities in Chicago.
So I'm sure there's a story there. How did you get into it? Is this part of your educational background? Is there something in your personal story that's related to disability?
Yeah, there isn't. It's funny. The reason I got into it has nothing to do with my personal experience with disability, which I think I only reflected on much later in in that journey. But when I was a teenager, I'd gotten saved as a teenager, came to faith in Christ, and was at a church where they had a deaf ministry. And I became friends with a teenager who's about my age. I think he was like a year younger than me. And we became friends through passing notes back and forth on a piece of paper. He was deaf. His name was Ebby. Was a really good friend for quite a few years. We haven't stayed in as much contact over the years. But we went back and forth, and he just regularly talked about how there was nothing for deaf teenagers to do. And so this was in the days of AIM, if you remember, AOL Instant Messenger. And we would go back and forth and even on AIM and talking about that. And one night, as he was telling me, hey, I'm just bored all the time. I was like, you know what? I'm going to do some research, and I'm going to find, this is early 2000s. I'm like, I'm going to find out what is there to do. So I went on to askjeeves.com and I asked Jeeves, what is there for deaf teens in New York? That's where I'm from. And so looked into all of that and found nothing. Wow. Like everything was focused on deaf adults. A lot of stuff in New York is for the deaf LGBT community. That's a longer conversation. There's a lot of intersection between the deaf world and the LGBT world.
Really?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
I did not know that.
Yeah, there's a lot of intersection. In fact, I think they say the majority of ASL interpreters identify, especially male interpreters, identify as LGBT. So it's a really interesting parallel, and I think it has to do with a lot of the narratives and personal stories of not being fully understood by parents. Like there's just a lot of overlap in understanding and like in the narrative, in the person's narrative. But but I'll put that to aside for a second. So I started doing research and found, with the limited things you could find on Ask Jeeves back then, found that it was like, deaf teenagers have a higher rate of depression and anxiety. They had a really high rate, especially in New York, of gang activity and drug abuse. And I was a new believer, just getting involved in our church, and went to the leaders and said, hey, I think we should start a youth group for deaf teenagers. And like one of their first things was like, well, one, who are you? And like, why would you do that? And like, do you know sign language? And my response was, no, I don't know sign language. I don't know any of these things, but I feel like we need to do this. And I was so blessed that through multiple conversations, the church in New York really got the mindset that like, hey, listen, it's not that we're not reaching out to them. It's not that that's the only problem. The problem is the world is reaching out to them, and Christians aren't. Like we need to move forward. And so that's how I really got entered into disability ministry, focused on the deaf. And then as time has gone on, I've reflected more, just realizing some people said like, well, why was that important to you? And for me, I'm like, well, I'm a Christian. When I came to faith in Christ, I was like, shouldn't everybody be welcomed into the body of Christ? Like there shouldn't be any exclusions. Deaf people shouldn't be like turned away from the youth group or those things. And so that was a big thing. But also I grew up with a sibling who had some learning disabilities, and my father has chronic illness, severe Crohn's disease since I was little, which I never put into the category of disability until I grew in my understanding of a theology of disability and just how the disability world is seen, and went, oh yeah, that affected so much of our lives and affects his life on a daily basis. But
wow,
yeah,
okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Did you go? What's your educational journey? Did you do a degree in disability ministries or theology or anything, or is it something that you just kind of self-taught along the way, or?
So theology. So I did my bachelor's degree in theology, and then did my master's I did an MDiv at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so, but throughout most of it, I really did do a lot of focus on a theology of disability.
Okay.
So whenever I had a paper in class that was like, hey, you can write on whatever, I was like,
okay.
I wonder what like John Swinton has to say about this. I wonder what like Stanley Hauerwas was writing a little bit on mental health and different things. So I tended to focus on the disability view of theology.
Yeah, so let's come back to that question I asked earlier, or maybe we'll ask it to you online originally. Like, what? I think I asked you about like mental health. Like, if somebody suffers from depression, is that a disability or anxiety, or is mental health questions a different conversation?
Yeah, it's such a complicated question, right?
Yeah. I
think for one, because there's such a stigma with disability, so that so many people who have a mental health diagnosis will say, well, I don't see myself as having a disability. I don't want to be seen as having a disability. However, they would recognize that their different mental health diagnosis is often disabling. And so for that reason, oftentimes mental health is put under disability, and especially depending on how that really looks in your life. So, for example, someone who experiences depression and anxiety, I find that oftentimes they'll say, oh, well, no, I'm not in the disability ministry, which is why for us at Moody Church, we actually decided there are a few things that we had to say, okay, the disability ministry covers 5 areas at our church, but we know that we have to section certain things out on our website so that people of varying abilities know that we hear them and we love them and we understand them. So like with mental health, if you go to the disability ministry page, which is like moodychurch.org/139, it's based on Psalm 139, fearfully and wonderfully made. If you click, you can get there and then you can click to mental health. But a lot of people feel weird about that. And so all they have to do is go to moodychurch.org/mental health, and they go to just the mental health page. Okay. And the same thing's true for our deaf ministry, because a lot of deaf actually reject the term disabled.
Really?
In fact, that was like, that was a big advocacy movement, especially in 1990, which kind of brought about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, because of a protest that took place at Gallaudet University, if you've heard of that. It's a big deaf college in Washington, D.C., and they had a rather large protest when a new president was put in place, a woman who wasn't deaf and didn't know sign language. And so they had a big protest at Gallaudet calling for a deaf president to be installed and someone who knew sign language, which resulted in a guy named I. King Jordan being the first deaf president of an American university.
Wow.
And I. King Jordan had acquired deafness, so he wasn't born deaf, but he did know American Sign Language, and he's famous for a phrase in the deaf community that the deaf can do anything hearing people can do except hear. And so the whole philosophy there, and on a lot of the signs in the marches, and especially at Gallaudet still today, is that deaf is not disabled. And so tends to take the form of diversity. So the diversity model or the social model of disability, as opposed to the medical model of disability.
Can you unpack that a little? I know where you're going with that, but can you unpack the difference there? The diversity.
Oh yeah, sure. So there's so many different views in the disability world. I think that's one of the things that I've loved about serving the disability ministry and just doing disability theology is that I'm regularly interacting with people, especially being in the city, because you have people all over the political spectrum, which definitely has some influence in your theology. And like all of that, just because they're advocating, they're doing different things. So the medical model of disability would look primarily at disability as dealing with the biology of a person.
Okay.
And so the focus is always on cure, or it tends to be a focus on cure. So biomedicine, how does biomedicine help to cure a person? Whereas the social model of disability will tend to use the word healing. And so you'll find in the social model of disability, it tends to focus not simply on a person's biological difference, but rather how it is that the world responds to that biological difference.
Okay.
And so one of the things that, one of the great examples of this is in John 9, right? Where all of a sudden the disciples, we don't know which disciple it was. I always assume it was Peter because he put his foot in his mouth, right? So Peter says, or one of the disciples says to Jesus, who sinned that this man was born blind? Was it him or his parents? And Jesus says, no, it was so that the glory of God might be put on display. And so that's one example that many people using the social model will look at, and they'll say, listen, disability has a social component where the world looks in and has a problem, and rather God's glory is simply not being seen properly.
Okay. What would, just with that, and from a Christian perspective, there, even in that story, there still is healing of the biology that happens. And even like part of the messianic vocation is the deaf will hear, the blind will see. There will be a reversal of that. So, I mean, from a Christian perspective, would you say it's kind of a both and, or there is something that needs to be healed in the biology? Or?
Yeah, I mean, so there's so much debate about this. Like there's really a lot. There's a great book that was written by a woman. I can't remember her name. It's let's see. I think I have it there. Daphne McKinney Fox. She wrote a book about actually the different ways that the narratives of healing are treated throughout the Gospels. And she brings out some interesting points on how all these different people have read those healing narratives. Because some will, I think she really brings out like three main ways that people will take it. Either they'll say like, listen, this isn't to be authoritative. Jesus was functioning within his time, and he was a product of his time. And so he was just trying to heal, and he wasn't really seeing the diversity of the people. Then there are those who would say, no, this is like the body is broken and it needs to be healed. And like your disability is an abnormality that needs to be normalized. And so you tend to get those words of normality rather than the words that a lot of the disability community uses now of typical. They would say typical body as opposed to normalized body, normal body. And then you get another view that would say, hey, it's got to be a little bit more in between, and we've got to figure that out. And for us at Moody Church, it's always difficult because, again, urban church, different places where people are coming from. But the mindset that I've taken, or at least what I've taught our volunteers as we train them, just our team, and even when I teach our classes for those with intellectual disabilities, I really teach this idea that I call holy, holy, holy. And it comes from basically a conversation I had with a few of the students in our class for adults with intellectual disabilities. We were going through the story of Doubting Thomas. It was like about 7 years ago. So it was like the start of the disability ministry. And we had a curriculum that we don't use anymore. And it had like a picture of Thomas, right? So I give a picture of Thomas and a picture of Jesus with his holes in his hands. And we're talking about it. And I'm talking about like the doubt and how it's okay to doubt. And I'm like, that's the thing that they really need. And then one of our ladies with Down syndrome asked me, she said, like, she was just so fixated on Jesus. And she said, what about me? And I thought she was talking about doubting. And then we as I got further into the conversation, she said, like, am I going to look like me when I get to heaven? Like, will I have my eyes? Will I have my nose? Will my feet be similar, or will I be completely different? Will I be like everybody else? And so there was this question of, will her diversity continue in some way in the kingdom? And as we looked at Jesus, who has holes in his hands, for me, one of the things that as I was reading, I decided to do a whole bunch of reading on this. And like, I wanted to understand, like, how can I I help gain some clarity on this? I think one of the things that we took away is that for our discipleship process, we want to always help people to understand that you can be holy, 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 meaning you can have holes in your hands and be holy, like in that way, like there's holy. And then and even if you have holes in your hands, you can still be whole, WHOLLY, and you can be holy living for Christ. And so it's three different types of holiness, right? But we actually see that in Jesus Christ, that discipleship can be holy, holy, holy. And even as we look at Luke 14, which is like one of the big images of the eschaton, like one of the things we have to notice is that people with disabilities are at the king's table, which is unsettling, right? Like Jesus says, like, the kingdom will look like this when he's telling his host that, hey, your table doesn't reflect my table. Your table, like you invited all these people, but if you wanted it to look like the table in the kingdom of heaven, you would have brought in the deaf, the lame, the blind, the foreigner, the refugee. They would have had a place at my table, according to Luke 14. And so I think there is something in that we would have to say that there is some form of our holiness, HOLE, right? That does continue into eternity. And I think for me, when I've had that question, I've said, hey, I think it seems to me whatever is beautiful, whatever is truly redemptive, whatever brings glory to God, I believe that'll continue on. Not necessarily. I don't think the inhibitions will continue, but I do believe that as we look at the stories of the gospel, like the marks of our faithfulness and the marks of our diversity can continue on. Like you look at people with autism, different, and then the joke in the autism community is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But many in the autism community, you find that they have just a beautiful honesty that you find nowhere else. So like Lamar Hardwick even talks about this. He says in his church, you can trust what he says because he's just like he's like I don't like my facial depressions he's like I don't read facial expressions properly, and so he says, listen, I'm just going to speak honestly. And so if that's the case, will that honesty, will that neurodiversity that brings about just absolute honesty continue on? Some of our people with Down syndrome, they have this absolutely amazing uninhibited love and hospitality. Will that continue into the kingdom? Totally. And so
and it's hard to separate those virtues from their disability, right? I mean,
exactly.
I've got a good friend of mine here in town he's adopted 2 kids with Down syndrome, and you know, him and his wife, the way they talk about how much Jesus they see in their kids is just so precious. Like they're never depressed, always like excited to see people, like the social like just love and joy they have, and like unaware of just when people are like say something mean or whatever, like they're just they don't even care. It's just like they're just living in the moment. Like there's so many virtues that they embody and other things that they miss out on, you know. But it's like there is that. I think I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but like however we connect disability to the fall and resurrection, there should always be a here and now diversity component to it, right? I mean, even if, say, his Down syndrome might be changed in the resurrection, he will no longer have that. His chromosomes will look typical. Now in this already not yet, there is a beautiful diversity component that's intertwined with the disability that God has made beautiful through something that might have otherwise not been enjoyable for the person or whatever, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I even look at it this way. Like, I think for me, one of the most challenging things when I was wrestling through that question with our class was how prideful am I that I think she needs a greater transformation than I do.
Right.
Because I think in my mind, I had always assumed, I'm like, eventually you'll get to be like me and how wonderful I am and how, like, look at all the things I can do, as opposed to, oh, wow, you're going to be transformed into glory and I'm going to be transformed into glory. and there's going to be continuity for both of us. And maybe I just don't know what that continuity fully looks like. I don't believe that she's going to have any inhibition. I think for the deaf, I don't believe that the deaf are going to be eternally unable to communicate with others. But do I believe that the ability to use sign language will continue into eternity, that beautiful form of expression will have its place, and the pieces of deaf culture, like Revelation says, every kingdom will bring their glory in. It's like, will the deaf culture be able to bring their glory in? Because they really have a culture. And I'm like, I think that's going to continue. And all the people that struggled learning ASL, in heaven, it won't matter if it takes them a million years to figure it out, but they'll be able to do it. Just as the deaf will be able to learn Mandarin.
I didn't even think about that. Like, there's certain aspects of the human experience that are created because there is a deaf culture, right?
Oh yeah.
Or because I want to, I don't know. I've got a tension in my mind right now. On the one hand, I look at, again, the messianic promise: the deaf will hear, the blind will see. What is that? Yes. Does that mean the deaf won't hear, or only if they want to? Maybe I don't know. You see Jesus healing the deaf as part of the inbreaking of the new creation. From a natural law standpoint, this is something I think I brought up to maybe Lamar or somebody, or it's more of a question. It's like, so like, I'm deaf in my left ear. I don't know if you know that. I'm deaf in my left ear, and like, if you go from a design perspective, the ears on Homo sapiens have a design. They're designed to hear. So if it's not doing that, it's not functioning according to its design. So I would assume that the designer would set right his design when he repairs all things. So that's one side of my thinking, is just like, well, it makes more sense that the blind would see, the deaf would hear. But then, like, does that mean sign language will be non-existent in new creation? That, like, because there's no, or like you said, there's certain, I've learned this recently, that there are really interesting, beautiful aspects of a deaf culture. I went to the largest deaf, the Bible, one of the largest deaf ministries in the world, Door International. The guy who helped me start the center helped start that, Claire DeGraff. I don't know if you know.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So
cool.
I went to one of its headquarters in Nairobi and sat there in the worship service with all deaf. And I'm like, there's different things going on here that I'm like, I wouldn't have been able to experience it. They wouldn't have been able to experience if they weren't deaf. And one of the guys explained to me, there is a whole deaf culture. Like it's not just they can't hear. Like, that has created this whole different cultural environment. Is all that going to be done away with if all the deaf are healed? So I don't know. It's a weird tension, and part of it
is a weird tension. And I think a lot of people get really freaked out by that, especially, like, I teach at a conservative school. Like, Moody Bible Institute is known as a very conservative theological school. And Moody Church is, I would say, theologically conservative. I'm not talking politically more diverse, but theologically conservative. And a lot of people feel really uncomfortable when you talk about, like, deafness going on into eternity. Mm-hmm. But I think that's because we're so focused on the biomedical model. We're focused on that medical model as opposed to the social model. And even the deaf have a differentiation there that I don't think we typically think about. So, like, if you've done any work with the deaf, you've probably noticed that the deaf will typically use capital D, deaf. And that refers to deaf culture. So you wouldn't say someone, oh, this is a deaf person with a lowercase d, because that would only describe the physical reality that they're unable to hear. But the capital D talks about someone who's like, oh yeah, I'm deaf, but I'm involved in the culture as a whole. Typically, people who are capital D deaf will say, oh, I am deaf, and that's part of their identity. Unlike a lot of the other people in the disability community, they have historically rejected people first language. So if you know people first language, it's like, for example, someone with Down syndrome historically has said, hey, I don't want to be called Downs. Rather, I want to be called a person with Down syndrome, or a person who has autism, as opposed to being called autistic, though that's even creating some debate now. I know there's some people who prefer the title autistic, but that's in part because a culture has formed around those communities where there's greater pride in it. And for the deaf, I think as Christians, I think we can and should affirm that the capital D deaf, like that culture, is going to go on into eternity. Does that mean that they won't be able to hear into eternity? I don't think so. I don't think that there's going to be inhibitions, but I think the beauty of their culture, like, that won't go away. What's made them them, and what they can introduce to the beauty of creation. Yeah.
This came into my mind. Like, what about the beauty of music? Like that.
Oh yeah.
Is there to me, there's a sadness that music is one of the few. I don't know. Maybe it's not few, but like one of the things that transcends culture. Like, it does seem to be so built into creation, and just when something's out of tune, no matter what country you're in, no matter what language, no matter where, it's people know that there's a in tune and there's out of tune. There's music that has the rhythm of creation built into it, and others that go again. It's such a beautiful aspect of creation, and to think that deaf people can't hear that, And I was born deaf in my left ear, and my mom put me in sign language when I was a kid, lip reading class.
Oh wow. I
didn't continue. I don't know how to read lips. But she was like, hey, if your other ear goes out, you're deaf. So, we would need to prepare you ahead of time for that. And I probably will. People lose their hearing as they get old. I'll probably lose my hearing a lot quicker, especially since I listen to really, really loud heavy metal music when I work out.
Well, Preston, honestly, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because I'm sure that like one or two of our deaf are at Moody Church are going to be watching this on YouTube with captions, and they'll be like, you better say the right thing there, because that's actually one of the big debates in deaf culture, or not debates, but probably I should say it's one of the big frustrations within deaf culture, that there's a perception that deaf don't enjoy music.
Oh,
in fact,
okay,
it's a common trope that's used in like most deaf movies. And listen, I love these movies. Like, I thought Coda was phenomenal. I have deaf friends that hated Coda. Same thing with like Mr. Holland's Opus or all those things. But like this constant theme that typically comes up in movies that feature deaf actors is this sense that, the deaf don't enjoy music. So if you saw Coda on Apple TV, that was a big thing. It's like, well, why would you do music? We can't enjoy music. Or Mr. Holland's Opus, his son doesn't enjoy music. But actually, a lot of deaf really enjoy music. They really enjoy the vibrations. So the vibrations are a big part of it. And there's actually even a lot of deaf poetry groups that use music, that use the vibrations to create something. And there's actually so much around it. Like, there are deaf choirs. There's a deaf choir here in the city of Chicago that's been around. It's a deaf church choir that I've been friends with their leaders and different things. And so a lot of the deaf actually really enjoy music and being a part of music. And not everyone who's deaf has 0% hearing.
Okay.
Many do have hearing at certain pitches and levels, and they do enjoy that. So what I want to get across is the fact that even within deaf culture, there is a way in which to engage in music in beautiful ways with poetry. Like, deaf poetry is really beautiful and different. So like, there's so many different ways of doing it. There's sometimes so it changes the language in those moments. So like, there's typical signs that you would use when you're trying to communicate a story. But when you're doing deaf poetry, you'll mostly use what are called classifiers, which is basically you're kind of describing the picture with your hands rather than using the sign for it. And so if I was saying like, I'm going to sign here. So people who are doing the podcast like I do, I listen to the podcast when I'm on the treadmill regularly, so they're not going to understand this as much. But if I said, I went for a walk through the park, which would be the sign for walk, and then the sign for through, and then PARK, because park is a finger-spelled word. Instead, what you would do in like deaf poetry is you would put the sign for trees, and you'd have like the trees maybe even moving, and you'd have a person walk by the trees. And so there's a different way of doing it that has a beauty that might even go with a beat or something else around it. And so
that's part of the deaf culture that kind of beautiful art can only be created because there is a deaf culture, deaf community.
Exactly. think about it, like everyone else who does music, like there's very little, at least in American culture, of using your hands to communicate music, to be able to go along with the beats. And that's something that the deaf bring. Now, there are plenty of different cultures that do use a lot of hands or different things. I think of Hawaiian culture, and we just did a luau for our disability ministry this past Friday. So now I'm thinking about the Hawaiian hula dancers. But yeah, like there's something about that.
And even so, going back to the music, while there's certain aspects of music that a fully deaf person would not be able to enjoy or participate in, there's other aspects of music that they would be able to experience or enjoy more fully than somebody who's not deaf, like the vibration aspect. And like, there's aspects of music that I'm not connecting with, that because I'm so focused on the audio, the strictly audio aspects of it. Would that be true? I mean,
so true. When I was involved with the deaf church in New York, it was like, the first thing that just totally surprised me my first time there was that they had a deaf drummer. So the drummer went forward and he was drumming the beat to the song as someone led, and everyone was copying the signs that the leader was doing. But like, I had never felt the vibrations in this music, and he was playing the same way that we'd play probably the song in, like the drummer would play the song in the sanctuary with everyone else. But I was really feeling the vibration and being able to hear that along with feel that. And so like oftentimes I'm not feeling as I'm singing or as I'm listening. And so there is something that they bring there, even the culture brings.
When I worshiped with that deaf community in Nairobi, they had a drummer with a big, it was just like a circle, like probably 40 people maybe.
Yeah.
And they had it as a church service, and it was so eye-opening. There's a lot of overlap with normal church service and other things that weren't. One of the most shocking things that was like obviously a no-brainer, but I just haven't experienced it, was they don't close their eyes during prayer. Like, all right, let's pray. And I'm like this, and all of a sudden I look up, and he's like looking at you and looking at, because they're the person praying, signing, and then they go to another person. It's like, it was so participatory and so involved. I almost felt a little bit uncomfortable. Like, I'm looking at everybody and they're looking at me, and but like, we're praying. Of course we're gonna look at each other. How else can you pray with your eyes closed, But that drum, it was a thumb, thumb, thumb. And they were a lot of clapping, a lot of physical participation with the people, because they were going with the vibrations, the rhythm and everything. And it was just like, wow, there's just aspects of human experience that were drawn out here that I've never experienced. And they were beautiful.
Exactly. And so you look at things like that and you're like, wow, no, there's no way that beauty doesn't have a role in God's eternal kingdom. But there are disabilities. Like, again, my father has chronic illness. He has Crohn's. He has an irreversible ileostomy. He is in constant pain, has been in pain for years. Like, I don't my father is not a Christ follower. But I look at many people who are Christ followers, who have diseases like that, and I look and I go, that doesn't seem like something that would continue into eternity. Like, pain does not. Like, I don't see anything that, and that's where I think the social model of disability really begins to break down, because there are a lot of people who would talk about the different pain associated with their disability. Some people who experience quadriplegia. I know that they just constantly have sores and all those things. And so there are some, it's funny, there's a spectrum here, because I have friends who have quadriplegia who regularly say, they're like, no, like my wheelchair is part of me. I don't see my wheelchair as a negative thing. I see it as something that liberates and frees me and allows me to move. Wow. And then I know other people who see their wheelchair as something that they can't wait to send to hell when they get to heaven. Yeah. And so that's why it's like, you can't really speak for one group of people here, but you can look and you can say, okay, there's something here that is beautiful, and there are some things here that we have to say, it's like, no, that's going to be shed away, and that's going to be good, and we're going to celebrate we're going to celebrate healing, which will have a medical side, but it'll also have a social side to it.
That's good. So so even with deaf and blind people, some would say, I would love to be healed. Other people are like, I'm good. Like, this is part of my human experience that I don't want to see going away with, because it's so wrapped up into who I am. And other people are like, I can't wait to get new eyes and a new creation. There's wide diversity and perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so much of a different perspectives there. And I get it. So like our ministry here focuses on the deaf, the blind, intellectual disabilities, accessibility, and then mental health.
Okay.
And I look at each of those areas and they're very, very different. Like each of those areas, you're going to have people who are going to say like, hey, this is part of me. I don't know what it would mean to not have that. And then there are others who are like, no, I want this gone. So we're a church that's like in the middle of the city. We're in the heart of the city. We're just a couple of blocks from Michigan Avenue. And so we have a pretty large homeless population. And with that, we have quite a few people who experience schizophrenia. And you look at some of them and like plenty of them would say like, listen, I want this gone.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be this way. And then there are others you talk to and they're like, I'm not entirely sure who I would be if certain parts of this didn't continue on, which is so difficult because you're talking about a disability that truly alters your perception of reality.
Yeah.
And so like there's so many questions in disability theology that are really unsettling. I think John Swinton brought one out in one of his lectures that I still wrestle with, where he talks about a man who I think was brought to his hospital where he was a chaplain, who like believed himself to be the King of England or something like that. And the question was, is it right to give this man medicine? And then all of a sudden he realizes, no, he's homeless. Has no connections to anyone. And he's really struggling. Or is it more benevolent to say, you know what, live in the reality of your being incredibly wealthy. Like
give him a crown, give him a crown.
Yeah. Yeah. And the same thing with dementia. Like we know that like, at least here on this side of heaven, we know that it's better for a person to be affirmed sometimes in their perception for their healing. So an example I remember reading about a couple of years ago was a grandfather who was just constantly obsessed with monkeys coming loose in his yard. And I think he lived like in Montana or something where there's not monkeys regularly getting loose in the yard. And the family kept like focusing on, Grandpa, there's no monkeys. And what they found that was most healing was actually like, okay, let's help Grandpa round up the monkeys. And once we round up all the monkeys, then we can have a conversation with him and like go from there. And so there's all these different things about perception, like in our ministry to people now, how do we meet them where they're at? I think I just went on a rabbit trail there. I'm sorry.
No, you got my mind spinning. Because I mean, I immediately want to say like, no, we should align people with reality if we believe in certain.
Totally.
But you're throwing a wrench in that a little bit, like.
And I think I'm talking pastorally. Like
pastorally,
how do we help someone to be able to get to reality? Is it that we start with just saying like, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. Like I regularly have some people here with schizophrenia who have fights with people in the church that didn't happen. And it's so heartbreaking. Like it's really heartbreaking because relationships are truly destroyed and the other member of the relationship doesn't even know what happened. And so sometimes people will come to me as a pastor and they'll say, hey, I really need your help because they called me this, they said this. And it's easy to start off with, no, that didn't happen. Right. Remember, you have schizophrenia. Or I can meet them where they're at and seek to affirm all of reality around that, affirm their history with the person, talk with them about how that made them feel when they saw that or they heard that. Because some have schizophrenia that is purely auditory. Some have schizophrenia that has a hallucinative like part of that. And so what does it mean to affirm their reality, affirm their feelings and emotions, even if I'm not affirming their perception? Like, how do I affirm them for what they're really freaking out about, and then help them to find reality? It's the same thing with the grandpa who believes that monkeys are released on his front yard in Montana. It's like, it's one thing to say, no, there are no monkeys. It's another to say, you know what? I want to affirm that he's freaked out right now. He's scared.
Right.
He's feeling out of control. How do I help him regain control, and then meet him in lucidity, as opposed to trying to force lucidity on him.
Right. No, that's good. That's good. That's helpful. Tell us just briefly about your church. I mean, you're at a church that's very well aware of disability, and it sounds like you're attracting a lot of people that do have a disability. Is that okay for me? Correct my language too. I want to learn and grow. Is that?
I'm someone who is always going to use people first language unless somebody tells me not to. And so people first language means exactly what you just did.
People
a person that has with a disability or people who have a disability, as opposed to saying disabled people. But everyone is different and people want different things. So a lot of people I talk to who have acquired a diagnosis later in life, people like Lamar Hardwick and even other people at our church that I know, but I know Lamar is known by people who listen to your podcast because he's been on there. Like people who typically have a diagnosis later in life, I believe his came in his 30s, will typically take the title of autistic. They're like, I am autistic.
Okay.
And they rejoice in that because it's a label that has given them freedom to understanding themselves. Whereas a lot of people who were raised with that diagnosis, they knew it, they're going to say, no, I don't. I have so much more to me. Like I was raised with an understanding of that. I'm Chris, I'm John, I'm Adam. Like that's who my identity is first.
Right.
And then I happen to have autism. So I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong. I feel like I'm regularly finding out that you're going to offend somebody no matter what.
Yeah. So you said the best default though is to lead with people first language. And then if somebody doesn't prefer that, then make a change.
Yeah, I would say lead with people first language, except when it comes to the deaf. The deaf are pretty universally. They would say, "Hey, no, I'm deaf," and so it's considered typically like. So hearing impaired is an awful phrase. We don't use hearing impaired. That's something that like I regularly have like been at conferences or spoken different places and been like, hey, you really should change that sign. Don't say hearing impaired. It's seating for the deaf and hard of hearing, if you want to say that.
Hard of hearing is fine.
Deaf and hard of hearing, because those are two different categories of people within the deaf community that make up the deaf community. And so like that's fine, but we don't use hearing impaired. But yeah, broadly, I would say try to be loving. And don't be so afraid. I think so many people in the church are just afraid of interacting with people who have disabilities, and it's incredibly problematic.
Okay.
Right? Like it's so incredibly problematic because all you need to do is say hi. All you need to do is say hi, introduce yourself. But the fear that comes with people with disabilities has resulted in people with disabilities being among the most unchurched people in America. Yeah, and you have to look, like, I think the statistics are 1 in 10 Americans. I could have that wrong. I believe it was 1 in 10 Americans have a disability. And yet most of us would look around our churches and say, like, we don't see that.
Yeah.
Like, we don't see 1 in 10. I used to work for Johnny and Friends, if you know Johnny Erickson Tata.
Yeah.
So I used to work as their urban engagement director for Johnny and Friends Chicago, like helping churches to really grow in their understanding of disability and love. And one of the most common responses I would get, because I was working for them and Moody Church at the time, they would say, well, can you just send them to your church? And I was like, no, I want to help you to be able to love them well. And they're like, well, like, we're just not equipped for that. We're not. And it's so, like, it's such a problem, I think, and this is more of an extreme thing, right? Like Jesus says you're supposed to go for the 1 as opposed to the 99.
Yeah.
But what about when it's 10 instead of the 90 and you're still like, at least it's 10 and you're saying, no, I'm not going to care for them. It's too difficult. Hopefully another church can.
I thought Lamar might have even said 20%. Don't quote me on that. Is it
20? You're probably
that
right.
Might have been worldwide though. That might have been worldwide. But either way, 10 to 20, that's, I mean, he said, people with disabilities are the largest minority population on earth.
That's definitely true. Yeah, you know what? It is 20%. I just looked it up because I thought I was probably wrong.
Wow.
So So it's 26%.
Have some kind of,
which is kind of wild.
Something that would be categorized as a disability. That might include mental health, or no, mental health would be higher than that.
Oh yeah, it's much higher than that. A lot higher.
So
But
you're
it's
a
like,
church.
yeah.
You're a church where this topic is front and center. What does your church look like that makes it a lot more welcoming for people with a disability than maybe other churches?
Well, I would say that we have a very, very long way to go. So
Yeah.
I don't think that we have arrived. I think the fact that even I am the pastor for disability ministries is a sign that we have not arrived. I think truly, like, disability ministry is
just ministry.
yeah, I mean, we will have succeeded, I think, when all of a sudden we say, like, oh, there's no need for a pastor for disability ministries. Like, people with disabilities are integrated and loved in every area of the church. And so one of my friends, Dan Vanderplaat, who works for Elam, he wrote a book about this called There Is No Asterisk. And Dan says that there are 5 stages of attitudes toward disability. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that 5 stages chart. No. So if anyone's interested, you can look it up on Google, 5 stages of attitude toward disability. And what I love about it is it says, listen, it starts with ignorance. So again, you think of like the disciple who says, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's born blind? Like that's the ignorance stage. Then from ignorance, you move to pity, right? Where you're like, wow, I feel really bad that this person is blind. It must be so hard. And it's like, that's better than ignorance, but that's not where we want to stop. Mm-hmm. And then it comes to care, where we go, you know what, maybe I should do something about this person who has a disability among me. Maybe I can guide them to the bus. You know, like when the church service is over, I can offer my arm and say, hey, would you want to take my arm? And I can walk you over to the bus stop. And then friendship is the next stage, the 4th stage, which says, you know what, not only am I just going to walk you to the bus, but I actually want to develop a friendship with you. I want to know your likes and your dislikes. I want to go to coffee. I want to share a meal. I want to enjoy time with you. But the ultimate goal is number 5, which is co-laborer, where it's not simply that it's like, oh, I'm your friend. It's not simply that I care for you. It's not simply that I feel bad for you. But it's actually the point where all of those get transformed to the point where we say, hey, you have a role in building God's kingdom, and you have a role in ministering to me, and I have a role in ministering to you. And we are actually co-laboring in the kingdom of God together, walking in the same direction. And typically in membership classes at Moody Church, we always start with talking about disability and saying, like, hey, where do people think we are? And so people will see the interpreter in the front of the sanctuary. People will hear about our class for adults with intellectual disabilities. It's called co-laborers, or they'll hear about our buddy programs, mental health ministry, all these different things. And they'll go, surely Moody Church, we're at a 5, or they'll say we're at a 4. And as someone who can kind of do a bird's eye view, I'm like, we're like 2 to 3. We're like pity to care. Like, we've got some care ministries. We have a couple people that are friends, very few that are really working and like co-laboring in ways that I would love to see, that we're working on that. But it's a long way to go, I think. And so I would say that we're trying. And I think that's huge. And I think so many in the disability world right now who have been regularly pushed away from the church, who have been told, like, I have so many people in our ministry that they came to us because they were asked to leave another church. And so just to be able to say, hey, listen, we have a place for you. We have a room set up for if your loved one is really struggling during the service, or maybe you yourself are experiencing overstimulation. We have a room where you can watch the service, and we have sensory tools and different things so that you can experience, you can worship, but in a way that's not going to completely unsettle you, a way that you can be a part of the body of Christ. So we have a whole bunch of different venues to be able to do that even in.
I want to get this. I love these 5 stages. So ignorance,
5 stages.
Ignorance, pity, care, friendship, co-laborer.
You got it.
So this maps perfectly on the LGBTQ conversation.
Dude, totally.
I mean, a lot of what you're saying does, especially when you're talking about the identity piece and people, you know.
Oh yeah.
But this is, each one is exactly like how, when people say we want to disciple and care for and reach out to, you know, the LGBT community and all these things, like going from, I mean, a lot of churches I would say are ignorance to pity. The really good ones are still in the sometimes care very few are in the friendship co-laborer. And that's really, I'm like,
totally. Yeah.
I always ask, I come in, a lot of churches have me come in and talk to their leadership team. And there's a question I always throw out. I said, would you hire a gay pastor? And it's so fun. Just the facial expressions and just like all the like angst, or, some of the ones were like, well, you tell us we're supposed, I'm like, well, first of all, you need to ask, what do you mean by gay, what, but like, if a human Christian is following a Christian sexual ethic, and whatever their temptation is, but they're following a Christian sexual ethic, if there's still a glass ceiling on like leadership, if they cannot teach, preach, be a pastor, then you're not, I would say that's kind of the ultimate test. Can you sit at the feet of somebody who is attracted to the same sex, has a different set of temptations you wrestle with, but is committed to the same gospel, committed to the same Jesus, committed to the same sexual ethic? If you cannot sit at the feet of that person, I would say we still have a ways to go. And people who are living pretty challenging lives and committed to holiness at all odds against them. If even that person is not, you can't sit at their feet, then we still have a lot of work to do in kind of our thinking. So can I use this? So who do I need to quote to use it? It was a guy.
Use it. It's Dan Vanderplaat. Yeah. Dan Vanderplaat, his book, There Is No Asterisk. And he talks about it. You can Google it, 5 Stages of Attitudes Towards Disabilities. But I think you're absolutely right. There's so much that aligns with the story of the disability community and the LGBT community. I think one of the things that I found, especially because there's so much of an interaction with the deaf community, like I was working with Christopher Yuan a few years ago. I think you know of Christopher. And like we were talking about this, just the storyline, the idea that so many, like the statistics are kind of remarkable when you find how many deaf parents of deaf children don't know sign language. And so they have like a home language, but not true communication, especially because there's a good amount of people who are deaf who are immigrants. And so their parents were learning another language. Like back in New York, we had quite a few people from Bolivia who like developed like the mother developed rubella, and then their child was born deaf. And like, so all these different things, like they came here trying to learn English. And so American Sign Language just wasn't added into all of that. And then sometimes you just have parents that choose not to learn American Sign Language for one reason or another. I can't get into all of that, but that feeling of like, hey, I don't fit into the rest of this world. I don't fit into my family. I was born this way. I didn't choose it. Like I have a different way of communicating than everybody else. Like there tends to be a story that really does map onto each other. And so there tends to be just great compassion between these two communities, which I think does lend itself toward often working together in different ways. And they have for the outcome that it's brought.
Yeah. What we can wrap things up. What if somebody's listening, they're a pastor of a church or they're an influencer in a church, and they're like, yeah, you say you got a ways to go. We need to get started on the way. What are some big picture things that would you say? And you can be bold if you want. It's fine. Like, what are some things that, like, man, these are every Christian church should at least be doing this, and this, just as a basic expression of the gospel toward 20% of the population that might not currently resonate with how your church is going about things.
Oh, that's so hard. I'm trying to think of what to start. I think the word I want to use is ramps. Build ramps.
Okay.
Start somewhere and build ramps. And so that might be physical ramps for like, it's like, hey, we have a room that's inaccessible, our sanctuary is inaccessible, put a physical ramp there, but also be thinking about what does it mean to build social ramps?
Okay.
So what does it mean to build social ramps so that people can be truly involved in all aspects of the culture of your church? And I think that can look like simply bringing a whole bunch of people into a room saying, hey, we just want to do a forum with people who have disabilities in our church. And we just want to hear from you all. like, what is it that you need? Like, so don't assume the need, but figure out what is the need, and then try to meet there to begin with. So like when we did that 8 years ago, one of the first things that we had quite a few people in our congregation who are blind, and they said to us, and blind is another community that typically they do say that blind first. I know that's confusing. Again, every community is a little different.
Blind and deaf lead with blind and deaf, not person with blind.
For the most part. Yeah, I'd say for the average, like that's the way it's going to be. But for our blind congregants, like they said, when you do a new song, we have no idea what's going on. Right. And I was like, what? And like, when you do scripture reading, we can't follow. And we were like, we never thought about that. And so we decided, like, okay, how much will it cost? And it's not expensive to send out the music the week ahead of time and braille the songs, to be able to braille those things. Or some of our, but you don't want to assume that everyone who's blind knows braille. Many people don't.
Okay.
And they don't know how to use braille. And so what you might want to do is you might say, hey, listen, can we get them a seat partner so that when we do like a really cool video that has no words, but just has no spoken words, but only written words on the screen, someone could be next to them and just tell them what the video is saying, or be able to give them the verse, like, hey, they're about to say this line before this song. So I'd say figure out what are the social ramps, whether it's an interpreter, whether it's all those things, and figure out that first, figure out what the need is. And then one other thing I would say is I think one of the biggest excuses I've heard from pastors over the years about why they don't have a disability ministry. And again, I don't even like that term because I don't think everyone should have a disability ministry. Yeah. Really, that doesn't. But
it's a good start, right? I mean,
it's a start.
Yeah,
it can be a good start. Like okay. I'm not advocating that I lose my job here at all. So if my staff is hearing this, that's not what I'm saying, right? But I think one of the biggest things I hear from people about why they're not doing anything for those with disabilities in their community is because they regularly say, well, we don't have anyone with a disability at our church.
Yeah. I know
what I want to point back to is like, hey, if you don't have anyone with disabilities in your church, that's your problem.
Yeah,
that
like,
you need
why
to
fix. Don't you have it
there? Like I live in Chinatown. So I live in Chinatown here in Chicago. If I started a congregation or I started a house church and there was nobody Chinese, I think everyone would say, wow, you really haven't reached your community. That doesn't make sense. Like Chinatown, Chicago is like 90% Chinese.
Yeah.
If America, and the city even more so, is 20-something% people with disabilities, if it's 13% those with physical disabilities, it's 6% those who are deaf. Like, if that's not showing up in your congregation, like you've got a problem. Yeah. Like you're not truly contextualizing. And I would just encourage any pastors listening to say, hey, maybe we should do a survey on our zip code, figure out who actually is in here, and figure out if maybe we have a problem, if we haven't been contextualizing well.
Eric, man, this is so much to chew on. Thank you so much for everything. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'm excited to see you at the conference next year.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've made it by the time this is released. Registration's open now, and we have Lamar coming out.
That's gonna be awesome.
I'm still trying to solidify. There's like a few other people I'm working on, and I haven't really talked to him yet, so I don't want to say it public. By the time this releases, maybe I'll already have talked to him. I also have, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her name. Hold on a second. This is terrible. I just had her on. Devin Stahl's coming out too.
Okay, cool.
Do you know Devin?
I don't, but that sounds like a great lineup you've got coming.
Yeah. So she was on the podcast a while back because she's a Theology of Disability. She has MS.
I heard her speak.
Yeah, she's super.
I listened to that episode.
Yeah. So I really want Lamar to kind of give the ecclesiological perspective, Devin to give a theological, and then I want a few more practical people who are kind of boots in the ground ministry. And yeah, I'm excited, man. This is an area that I have lots of passions and interests, and this is one that's like, man, I can't devote. I've got other things I'm devoting my full-time attention to, but this is always just right there nagging on my heart, tugging at my heart, and I am passionate and growing in passion for the church to be more of the holistic body of Christ toward the largest minority population, and we have so many examples of the gospel going out to people who are physically atypical. So thanks, Eric. Appreciate your perspective and grace.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks, man.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.